Dear colleagues, it's my great pleasure to proceed with the exchanges of this afternoon. In the second panel, Visual Cultures, Materiality and Education in Transnational Memory, New Approaches to Holocaust and Postwar Heritage in Central and Eastern Europe. We'll be having the pleasure of hearing 3 presenters, of which 2 in the room, as you can see, and 1 on Zoom. I hope Catherine is with us already.
Probably.
Because we can't see
Yes, I am.
Bonjour, Catherine. So I'll suggest the following. I'll present you all briefly, not to interrupt later on. Then you'll have each and everyone 30 minutes for your presentation, followed by a global discussion to finish the panel, if you agree to proceed. So we'll start with Zofia Wóycicka, who holds a PhD in history and is an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology of the University of Warsaw, where she's currently leading the NCN, National Center for Research, a research project helped delivered to Jews during World War II and transnational memory in the making. Previously, she worked as practitioner at the Polin Museum Warsaw and at the House of European History in Brussels, and as a researcher at the Center for Historical Research Berlin of the Polish Academy of Sciences Institut, and the German Historical Institute in Warsaw. Among others, she authored the monograph Arrested Mourning, Memory of the Nazi Camps in Poland 1944-1950, published in 2014, and co-edited with Natalia Alexiun and Raphael Utz, the collected volume The Rescue Turn and the Politics of Holocaust Memory, published recently in 2024. Is that exact? Catherine, who's with us on Zoom, will make the presentations and then we'll follow to the content immediately. Catherine Perron is a political scientist working as a researcher in the Center of International Studies, Centre d'études internationales of Sciences Po in Paris. She holds degrees from Sciences Po and the Freie Universität Berlin. She is specializing in Soviet and Eastern European studies, and today she works on migrations, memory, and identity in unified Germany. Her main subject of interest are forced migrations and the related politics of the past. In 2018, she published with Anne Bazin, How to Address the Loss, Forced Migrations, Lost Territories, and the Politics of History in Europe and at its margins in the 20th century. Her last research was on the museumification of negative pasts and displacement in Germany. Last but certainly not least, Pani Tartakowsky, that everyone in the room knows perfectly, but let me remind you just a few elements of her rich biography. Ewa is a sociologist and researcher at the CNRS, National Center for Scientific Research in France, within the Institute of Social Sciences of Politics, Institut ISP, and an associate researcher at the Center for French Civilization and Francophone Studies of the University of Warsaw. Her work explores contemporary Jewishness, since her PhD at least, focusing on the reception and production of literary works, the transmission and social uses of the past, memory patrimonialization, and history teaching. She has notably studied French writers of Jewish Maghrebi origin in the context of post-colonial France. Her current research examines the transmission of Jewish history in Polish schools since 1989. The presentations have been finished. Zofia Wóycicka, the room is yours for the next 30 minutes.
Thank you.
Could we show the presentation? Oh, thank you. So just explanation that I'm here, but actually the presentation was co-authored, or I should mention as one of the co-authors, Michalina Musielak, who is a colleague of mine in the project, and we designed and conducted the research I will be talking about together. She can't be here today because she's just giving birth. Okay, so I'll go directly to the topic. So over the last 3 decades, the subject of aid provided to Jews during the Holocaust has attracted growing attention from general public in Europe and beyond. This interest has been driven by mass media, most prominently, of course, by Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List, but the politics of remembrance led by various state and civil society actors at both national and international level also played an important role in bringing this topic into the limelight. According to researchers, the emergence of cosmopolitan memory was driven by the development of human rights discourses and the trend towards universalizing the history. And Holocaust memory has become more future-oriented within this process. In result, the past is increasingly viewed as a source of role models. And of course, this shift also explains the, one could say, fashion for the writers who provide sort of very vivid moral exemplars. However, in some European countries, efforts to emphasize the memory of the helpers were also a direct response to public discussion about collaboration, also including in France. But I will not talk about France today. Focusing on rescue was intended to neutralize difficult debates about the past. And in Poland in particular, the growing interest in this aspect of Holocaust history came in response to debates about Polish complicity in the Holocaust, which followed the publication of The Neighbors by Jan Tomasz Gross in 2000. Also in Germany, the rescuers gained a growing public attention already starting from the mid-90s. Unlike in many other countries, the debates here focus primarily on the exceptionality of the helpers. Consequently, aid providers are used to demonstrate what Kobi Kabalek called or expressed as what most Germans could but did not do to help Jews. However, at the same time, a 2019 survey conducted in Germany, showed that over 30% of the respondents thought that members of their family had helped victims of Nazi persecutions during the war. So there is a sort of ambiguity of this memory. So depending on how the rescue stories are being told, they can both enhance dialogue between formerly hostile groups, or they can also contribute to strengthening nationalism and perpetuating negative national stereotypes. In the last quarter century, over 10 museums and permanent exhibitions dedicated specifically to this aspect of Holocaust history have been opened or totally refurbished in several European countries. But what is their impact on visitors? In order to check this, Michalina and me, in collaboration with the Shipyard Foundation, conducted qualitative audience research in 2 righteous museums in Poland and Germany. And those museums are, as you see, the Ulma Family Museum of Poles Saving Jews in World War II, this is the official name, the Tadeusz Pankiewicz Pharmacy in Kraków, and the Museum Otto Weid Workshop for the Blind in Berlin. You can visit tomorrow if you want. So our aim was to find out how the different ways in which rescue stories are presented influences visitors' perception. We also wanted to ascertain the extent to which individuals' upbringing in diverse memory and visual cultures and their familiarity with different Holocaust narratives determine their reading of the analyzed exhibitions, and the extent to which globalization and the development of mass and social media have led to a convergence of perceptions. So I will try briefly to, no, this is not this, to tell you something about those 3 museums before I talk about the results of our research. So first, the Pankiewicz Pharmacy. Pankiewicz was I don't know if anybody of you knows the Pankiewicz Pharmacy. Okay, but not everybody, so I have to tell something about that. Okay, so Pankiewicz was a Polish dentist who ran a pharmacy on the territory of the Kraków ghetto, and he and his staff helped the ghetto inhabitants in various ways. And the first modest exhibition opened, and he became then Righteous Among the Nations, and the first modest exhibition opened in the pharmacy's former premises already in the early 1980s. In 2013, the display underwent a major reconstruction. The museum's main goal is to commemorate the Holocaust of Krakow Jews and the personage of Tadeusz Pankiewicz, a righteous among the nations. This is the official statement. Financed by the city of Krakow, the museum represents a rather open approach to Poland's history, albeit not very sort of a critical one, but still open and not based on this assessment of so citizens are both Poles and Jews, yes, in that sense. The second museum, the Ulma Museum, the heroes of this museum are Józef and Wiktoria Ulma, a peasant couple from a small village in southeastern Poland, who gave shelter to their Jewish neighbors. After a Polish policeman denounced them to the German gendarmerie, the gendarmerie murdered the whole family and also the people in hiding. The museum opened in 2016. Its mission is to, I quote again, present the history of rescuing Jews by Poles during World War II, show Polish-Jewish relations during the Holocaust, and disseminate knowledge about the fate of the Ulma family. Indeed, the exhibition tells the story of the Ulmas and other people from Subcarpathia who aided persecuted Jews. However, the story serves as a synecdoche for the stance of the entire Polish population. Originally, a local museum funded by the Subcarpathian Voivodeship Assembly, which was dominated or is still dominated by the right-wing Law and Justice Party. 2017 it came under the auspices of the Ministry of Culture. And it is in a way emblematic of the view of history promoted by national conservative politicians and historians in Poland. And finally, the Otto Weid workshop. Otto Weid was the owner of the workshop in Berlin-Mitte, and he's himself visually impaired. He and his collaborators protected Jews by employing them in the workshop, and later on, when this was not possible anymore, by providing them with hideouts. Sadly, only few of the people whom he helped survived the war. The exhibition opened in 1999 in the original workshop premises in Berlin-Mitte. A grassroots initiative in 2005, it was taken over by the German Resistance Memorial Center. And 2023, so very recently, the display underwent a major refurbishment. It tells the stories of Weid, his help network, and the mostly Jewish employees of the workshop. I will not go into detail, but not only the narratives of the museums are very different, but also their visual appeal. And important for our study is that the two museums, the Berlin Museum and the pharmacy, are sort of original historical sites, but they sort of play out this originality in a very different way. So in the pharmacy, it's more about scenographic, so it's in a sort of experiential museum, as very sort of popular in Poland, kind of building a scenography of the place as it might have looked like during the war. And in the Otto Weid, it's a very different approach to authenticity. They don't rebuild anything, they just try to show the different levels of history, for example, the paintings on the wall, the different colors and so on. So there is no reconstruction, and it's a more documentary approach. Okay. So now shortly about the method of research. So we conducted a comparative study among local and international high school students from Berlin, Krakow, and Rzeszów. And our research group comprised representatives of Generation Z, thus people born in or after 1996, who all grow up in time of globalization and are sort of immersed in a world of media. Yes, so they have a different approach to media than maybe I have. For most of them, World War II belongs already to the realm of cultural memory rather than communicative memory. The local groups comprised people who spoke Polish or German as their native language or one of the native languages, and participated in the local schooling system for at least 6 years. The international groups included students from European countries who had been living and studying in Poland or Germany for at least up to 2 years, and they all had to speak English on a communicative level. So there were 3 parts of the research. First, we made individual in-depth interviews with all the study participants online. Then we organized sort of individual visits to the exhibition, which were followed by directly by post-visit group interviews, which were conducted by people from the Shipyard Foundation, who are professionals in this respect. And finally, we did post-visit focus group interviews 1 month online, 1 month after the museum visit. But here, I will mostly focus on this second part, so on this group interviews after the museum visit, and we also included some visual techniques. For example, the students were asked to make photographs in the exhibition of things which were annoying or interesting to them and so on, and they were the starting point of discussions also. So now I'll come to the results. So first, on the very rudimentary level, the groups showed quite a uniform reading of the museum narratives. The study participants also shared many observations related to the exhibition's visual aspects. The differences between people coming from various countries became apparent only when we went deeper into discussion. One discrepancy concerned the attitude toward hero-centered and victim-centered narratives and the inclusion of multiple viewpoints on history. International students at the Ulma Museum missed other perspectives on war than those of the Polish rescuers. One interviewee said, for example, the museum, I quote, really just focused on the heroes, but not on victims. The students also agreed that the museum did not pay accurate attention to the history of the Ukrainians living in the region. Subcarpathia was before the war and during the war a multi-ethnic region with a quite big Ukrainian minority. The local students, interestingly, shared the opinion that the museum displayed mainly the Polish perspective on war. According to one interviewee, the exhibition focuses more on those who help Jews than on the Jews themselves. Even when they talked, the rescuers, about Jews, it said much more about the person talking than about the rescued people. I think it's a very sort of intelligent construction of perspectives. And so although none of the local study participants overtly criticized such a narrative choice, many seemed to read the exhibition against the grain, so to say. Instead of the helper stories, their interest focused on local history, in particular the fate of Jews during the Holocaust. As an example, the photo elicitation revealed that one of the exhibition's most attractive elements was an interactive wall with photos of the hiding places in Subcarpathia. In particular, the study participants were interested in the story of an oak tree where 2 Jewish men were hiding. One interviewee, this is what she says, was standing there for a good couple of minutes trying to imagine how they were hiding there and how they survived, because usually such a tree is quite small and narrow. She also reflected on how desperate the 2 men must have been to hide in such a place. By contrast, the Pankiewicz pharmacy, some interviewees were even in the pharmacy, some interviewers were disappointed not to learn more about the pharmacy's employees, the Polish employees or non-Jewish employees. Nevertheless, the international respondents appreciated that the museum paid so much attention to the history of the Krakow ghetto. I really like that they try to center the victims and survivors of the ghetto, said one student from Germany. Other interviewees also highlighted the exhibition helped to better understand the life of Jews in the ghetto by putting faces to their stories. A further difference in the exhibition's assessment pertained to a more critical versus a rather affirmative approach to history. This was particularly evident at the generally well-received Museum Otto Weid. Some of the local interviewees expressed concern that by stating that each person in hiding required a whole network of eyes, the exhibition falsely suggested that, I quote, half of the city were anti-fascists. International students in Berlin did not seem to share this concern of their German peers. On the contrary, they appreciated that the exhibition showed them new perspectives on history. In response to the interviewer's question whether they learned something new from the exhibition, one student said, I quote, maybe about the German perspective, because we were usually taught about Polish perspective. Polish Jews. Polish are great and the Germans are bad, and they killed everyone. End of quote. In Markowa, the exhibition provoked more ambivalent responses among the international students. One interviewee from Germany highlighted the museum's problematic generalizations regarding the heroic stance of the Polish society towards Holocaust. She said, I think it's more about the people were very brave that did this, but I think it's a little bit weird to generalize something like that. Local students, study participants, were less critical towards such a narrative. They generally agreed that the museum focused on heroic stories. However, they did not consider such a narrative as problematic. They were aware that, apart from those who eyed it, there were also those who did other things. Nevertheless, a common understanding emerged that the museum presented a relatively balanced perspective on Polish-Jewish relations during the war, and that, I quote, despite everything, there were more such places where Poles actually helped. Here you have longer quotations, I only quote the sort of meritum. Oh, yeah, I think it's this. Okay. So another important thread in the group discussion was the manner the museum treated national attributions. At the Ulma Museum, the students from Germany were moved by the presentation and expressed a sort of sense of responsibility as Germans. However, they also indicated unease about the black and white picture of the Germans as shown in the display. One interview stated that the exhibition evoked in her feelings of guilt and shame, and she said, when I was with the other group, I was really like, because there was so often like the Germans, and I was kind of feeling, oh, I don't want that the others know that I'm German. The local students did not articulate such direct criticism towards the way the museum portrayed German occupiers. But they also evaded simple national attributions, especially with regard to the perpetrators. For example, one student reflected on how the temporary exhibition used white, gold, and black colors to contrast the Ulma family with the German perpetrators. And he said, on the one hand, this is understandable, but on the other hand, it was not the fault of individuals. Here the real culprit is simply the war. So both local and international students at the Pankiewicz Pharmacy appreciated that the exhibition drew no distinction between good and evil along national lines and did not explicitly condemn the Nazi perpetrators and their Polish and Jewish collaborators. One local interviewee said, I also really liked that when they talked about people who collaborated with the German administration, they were not demonized. He thought that this gives visitors a greater opportunity to understand these people. The local students also believed that the exhibition offered a novel way of presenting the Holocaust victims by foregrounding their individual identity over their national or ethnic belonging. One of the interviewees deemed it good that the exhibition, I quote, shows these Jews as people, as residents of Krakow, as Poles, and it doesn't create a barrier that would immediately make people think that it doesn't really concern them. Okay. So I'm now coming to the very last part of the analysis. This is one of the examples of the sort of a response to the visual appeal of the exhibitions. So divergences in the exhibition's assessment also concerned this visual appeal, and as an example, one of the issues that emerged during the group discussions was the students' perception of the authenticity of the site. Local and international students alike felt that the display in Berlin did not give a proper idea of what the brush workshop really looked like. However, their ideas of how to highlight site historicity differed significantly. The local students questioned the authenticity of architectural elements and artifacts and scrutinized the use of historical sources. They suggested that more original artifacts and additional information would enhance the museum experience. This stands in contrast to the approach of the international students who thought the place would seem more authentic if the exhibition designers had reconstructed the old interiors and furnishing. A student from Italy wished the hideout, because there is a sort of place of the original hideout in the Otto Weid factory, so she said she would like the hideout to have furnishing, to see that they were really hiding there. Other international study participants also said that they did not feel the vibe of the former workshop. This is the expression used, the vibe. A student from Poland suggested the museum should try to create a more immersive environment. To achieve this, he said, I quote, it would have to set up so many more props around it because there are just 3 tables for the workshop tables for brush making, and they feel like so sterile. In response to a comment by another student that the curators may have lacked knowledge about what the workshop really looked like, he replied that in such a case they should, I quote again, set up the evidence. Sometimes the storytelling means that you have to lie. Okay, so I'll omit maybe the last part about the pharmacy. Maybe in the discussion we can come back to it, and I will come to the conclusions. So to sum up, our study confirms that the socialization in different memory cultures and visual cultures influences the way in which young people perceive historical exhibitions. However, it is evident that European integration and the globalization process have also influenced their reception of the displays, particularly the Erasmus students, but also local students from major cities such as Krakow and Berlin, demonstrated familiarity with diverse modes of exhibiting history and realized the existence of alternative perspectives on the past. They sort of formulated it. Our research also showed that the preferences of museum visitors do not always rely on what they are used to. Some of our study participants clearly distanced themselves from what they seemed most familiar with. This was evident in their appreciation of the Pankiewicz pharmacy, less emotional appeal of the Pankiewicz pharmacy as a pleasant change to what they knew from other Polish museums, or conversely, in their description of the sober German exhibition style as boring at the German students at the Otto Weid. Therefore, regarding museum perception, our research confirms the emergence of what maybe Daniel Levy and Michael Heinlein and Lars Breuer term reflexive particularism, which they describe as a disposition to change perspective and recognize the claims of the others. Also, in this case, also other forms of visual presentations of history. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Zofia, for this fascinating presentation. We'll get back, and perfectly respecting the time, which means we'll have enough time to get back to one of your last cases omitted in the discussion. I would like to check with the technique if Catherine is with us, and could we see her for the Catherine Perron, who is on Zoom? Yeah. Hello, Catherine. Bonjour.
Hello.
So, the presentations have been made. You will have 30 minutes as every one of the presenters, and the floor and the room before you is all yours.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll start with a technical question. How do you want me, I have a small PowerPoint presentation. Shall I share it on my screen? I guess that's the best way. If
yes, absolutely. Yeah.
That. I can't, you have to authorize me to share my screen. So here. Can you see it?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so wonderful. Thank you very much. Well, I want to start with thanking Ewa for inviting me to this conference, which I'm really very happy to be able to follow, at least for a part of it. I'm extremely sorry not to be in Berlin today. That was for personal reasons. I would have loved to meeting you. It's always better to be present in person than sitting somewhere remote in front of a screen, but I'll do my best. And I also want to express how happy I am to participate in a conference that is co-organized by Centre Marc and CERI, which are institutions where I used to be when I was to do my PhD at the beginning. So I have a strong tie to them, even though I haven't been back so much since then. And to ask you to excuse me because I have to leave the conference after this panel. So I already apologize for those who come after, which I won't be able to listen to. This said, I will present today some thoughts on the practices that constitute the construction of belonging in societies that have undergone or practice or both massive population displacements. I would like to approach this question through the prism of German heritage in Eastern Europe and the potentials and conflicts that it holds. And therefore, I will focus on encounters, exchanges, and conflicts that have emerged around collection, museumization, and or restitution, return of German objects after expulsion. I want to say that this reflection is the result of a collective research undertaken with several colleagues, among which Olga Sesneva, Cornelia Eisler, Anna Olimpieva, Magdalena Abraham-Diefenbach, during various meetings in Paris, Amsterdam, Oldenburg, Bonn, and elsewhere in recent years, and that we aim to publishing this as a dossier in the French review Critique Internationale. I have no, maybe this said, I want to emphasize that I have no results yet to present, so I'm very sorry. I will more start with three examples and with the questions that they raised to us. So I will begin with three cases dealing with reconnecting or not narratives about belonging and belongings across the border and across groups. Here you see a map with today's Europe and some of the places where which will be talked about and where they used to be before the border was displaced. In the summer 2021, about 100 pieces of the Bunzlauer Heimatstube collection, which you see here on this slide, located in Siegburg, Rhineland, which I go back, you see it's very much in the west, were transferred to the Ceramics Museum in Boleslawiec, Poland, in the Lower Silesian Voivodeship. So I go back and you see where it is. It's like 750 kilometers further away. The rest of the collection, more than 80 moving boxes full of ceramics, reference works on Silesia, its history and culture, as well as on ceramic arts and crafts, and on the local history of Bunzlau, documents and other objects such as beer bottles from the local brewery, hangers, kits, postcards, paintings, coats of arms, photo albums, and even chronicle testimonials and family histories. All of this is leaving and going to Haus Schlesien in Königswinter, not far from Siegburg, where it will be unpacked, inventoried, and stored in the proper manner. For these objects, this move adds, so you see here on this slide the moves done, adds to a biography already rich in movement. Taken with them from Bunzlau in Silesia, in formerly German Silesia, by families expelled after the end of World War II, the objects found their refuge in the Bunzlauer Heimatstube in Siegburg, a small town in the Rhineland where many former residents of Bunzlau settled after the expulsion. The Heimatstube was created at the initiative of the municipality of Siegburg and hosted in various spaces made available to the expellees by the municipality the objects. Their objects reminiscent of their lost homeland, some of which were created after the expulsion, were stored haphazardly. You can see that on this. Here you have like 4 pictures of what a Heimatstube looks like, and you see how things are displayed. They were kept somewhat in bulk and generally without being inventoried by the Association of Former Bunzlauer Inhabitants, the Bundesheimatsgruppe Bunzlau. Serving as relicts, these objects, most of which had little or no value, were not intended to be displayed for a large public, but rather to serve as a medium of remembrance, allowing the expellees to share their memories of their lost homeland, and thus help to overcome the trauma of expulsion and the hardship of the arrival in a new and partly hostile Western German environment, but also to get rooted in the new home. After being expelled and remaining virtually sedentary for 70 years, in 2015, the itineracy of these objects resumed. In fact, in 2015, a double break occurred, linked to the one hand on Germany's reception of other refugees, because the municipality of Siegburg, which had to respond to the influx of refugees, wanted to reclaim the premises made available to those expellees from Bunzlau 70 years ago. So they needed to get back this, this space. On the other hand, the generation of witnesses to the expulsion was disappearing, and the Bundesheimatgruppe Bunzlau, so their association, whose members were aging and whose ranks had thinned considerably, was no longer able to maintain and manage the collection, which was not visited by many people anymore, which raised the question of the future of this Heimatstube and of the objects in the so-called collection. Preserving the Heimatstube as such was therefore hardly feasible, and the citizens of Siegburg showed no interest in this German part or in the countries of Eastern Europe, nor did the descendants of the expellees who had integrated into their new Rhineland and West German Heimat. And as I already said, there were very few visitors. So the Stadtmuseum Siegburg, the local city museum, with which they had close ties, was therefore the obvious second choice to give the collection. What is interesting, however, is that despite its long-standing ties with the Heimatstube, so the local city museum of Siegburg had already hosted the collection of the Heimatstube. They had small exhibition of things connected with that history. And so one could have thought that they would be a natural destination. However, they refused to take over the collection on the ground that the Bunzlau pieces, which were, as you see, mainly ceramics, were not locally produced in the Siegburg region, and therefore, according to the director of the museum, there were not pieces that could be included in the Siegburg City Museum's collections concept. So symbolically, somehow, the museum, the West German museum, where many ex-police from Bunzlau had settled, and in which, in Siegburg, which had become godfather city to the Bunzlauer in the 50s, it now refused to integrate their history into the Western German local history. And this created a certain bitterness among the members of the Bundesheimatgruppe, who consider that they have greatly contributed to the West German reconstruction, that ex-police, among which themselves, have greatly contributed to the West German reconstruction after the war and to the Wirtschaftswunder of the 50s and the 60s. At the same time, however, interest was high, and here I come back to this slide showing the movements. At the same time, interest was high on the other side of the border, where the German past used to be silenced, namely in the Ceramic Museum in Boleslawiec, the Museum Keramiki w Bolesławcu, where the tradition of ceramics was taken up after the departure of the German by the Poles, who came to repopulate the town after the war, and who expressed a great interest in acquiring the collection of the Heimatstube. In fact, this relied on an older history, because since the mid-90s, exchanges had been taking place between the Heimatstube and the museum, the Boleslawiec Museum. The Boleslawiec Ceramic Museum was founded by the new authorities after the expulsion of the Germans in 1953 as a regional museum and transformed in 1968 into a ceramic museum, and was expanded in 1995 to include a department dedicated to local history. Taking advantage of a twinning agreement between the towns of Siegburg and Boleslawiec, initiated in 1992 as a part of the German-Polish rapprochement after the fall of the Berlin Wall, exchanges were established based on interpersonal contacts between the members of the Bundesheimatgruppe Bunzlau and staff from the Ceramic Museum, the municipality, and various research institutions as archaeologists, historians, art historians, etc., in Boleslawiec. This led to several joint activities, studies, scientific publications or non-scientific publications, participation in regional conference, for instance, in the Oder-Neisse Euro region, and above all in co-organized exhibitions. In addition to circulating objects across the border, these exhibitions sought to reconnect the threads of a shared history. In 2007, for example, there was a collaboration on Bunzlau ceramics, a shared heritage of the old and new inhabitants of Bunzlau Boleslawiec. This exhibition, consisting of a mixture of objects from the Boleslawiec ceramic museums, objects on loan from the Heimatstube Bunzlau, from private individuals, descendants of ex-police, for instance, and from the Haus Schlesien, was shown on both sides of the border at the Boleslawiec Ceramic Museum and the Schlesisches Museum zu Görlitz. I didn't show where the Schlesisches Museum zu Görlitz is, but it's very close to Boleslawiec on the other side of the border in the former Eastern Germany. From then on, as the loan of objects from the Heimatsammlung collections became commonplace, the Boleslawiec Ceramic Museum naturally expressed interest in taking over the collection. This was especially true given the excellent relations with Peter Börner, the director of the Bundesheimatgruppe Bunzlau, the association of former inhabitants of Bunzlau. The first steps were taken to work out an agreement to transfer the objects in the collection. However, this was halted by the reluctance of some members of the Bundesheimatgruppe to see these objects I don't know if you can talk of return, but go to Poland for good. One of the fears that was expressed was that by losing control over the objects, they would also, well, the expellees would also lose the control about the narratives about the German past in Silesia and Bunzlau and about the expulsion. So finally, the solution that was found was to transfer the collection to Haus Schlesien, not far from Siegburg, which you see here, which is in the west of Germany. And Haus Schlesien is a place run by the former inhabitants of Silesia, which houses the office of their association, an archive, a library, a restaurant, meeting rooms, a small hotel even, and also a museum and a collection of objects from Silesia. And Haus Schlesien finally agreed to take over the Bunzlau collection and showed a few rare, particularly noteworthy pieces in display cases of its permanent exhibition, like this is what I'm showing here, where those objects from the Bunzlau collection illustrate, and here I quote the museum director, the expertise in ceramics, but also represent the Eastern Heimatstuben phenomenon, the importance of the collection for those who were expelled, its role in preserving memory and passing it on to future generations. I finished the quote. However, and this is the interesting thing, the Haus Schlesien also signed a loan agreement with the Bolesławiec Ceramic Museum for about 100 pieces, as I said at the beginning, which made their journey back to Poland. These pieces were destined to join the permanent exhibition currently being renewed, and they were chosen to complement the Polish Museum's collection and to be a witness to the expertise of the Bunzlau ceramics and their artistic developments. Well, that's about this example about Bunzlau. I wanted to give two other examples, but I think time is too short to do this, about a second similar process which happened with objects taken from Odry to Neuenburg an der Donau and who got back there. And about objects collected in Kaliningrad, Königsberg, and that remained somehow there without really like establishing links to expelled Germans from Kaliningrad. I will pass on these two other examples to come to the questions we add in our collective work. Where I tried to change, yes, here, which is about belongings and belonging and sharing the memory of others. Well, there are many reflections on the necessity or even the possibility or impossibility of sharing the pain of others, as Susan Sontag entitled her famous essay. And in the field of memory, these reflections often aim to promote a culture of remembrance focused on recognizing victims. In other words, on remembering negative experiences. Paradoxically, the lessons learned from this negative memory are supposed to nurture positive values such as human rights, pacify social relations, and promote tolerance. However, such negative memory poses a challenge in many ways. First, it is based on a historically unprecedented practice, namely the awareness of one's own co-responsibility towards foreign victims. And in doing so, it does not only break with traditional modes of constructing national memories and therefore identities, but also goes against past practices of ending and pacifying conflicts, which generally focused on forgetting, as the German historian Christian Mayer showed in his book in 2010. But even more importantly, the practices of commemorating the experiences of foreign victims pose a problem, as those who carry this memory have not directly experienced the negativity. The German historian Reinhard Koselleck emphasizes how the experience of victims, and he's talking about Jewish victims of the Holocaust, pose a challenge to the collective German memory, in that the latter can be nothing more than a secondary memory reworked by history that is not based on direct experience, either lived or transmitted, particularly inside the families. But in our eyes, the question of sharing the memory of others go beyond the issue of negative memories and recognition of foreign victims. It seems to us that examining the conditions and modalities of accession to a foreign collective memory also allows us to take a fresh look at the ways in which we belong to our immigrant societies. In other words, this amounts to examining how memory, identity, and nation are woven together over time, but also in space and at different levels across national borders, and even more so to questioning the possibility for the present and the future to embrace other affiliations in the sense of attachment to places or groups others than those of origin, which lets us to ask or to take Gabby Dolf-Bonekemper's, who is an art historian's question: is it possible to include other narratives, values, interpretations, and memories in one's own imagination and thinking? And this is what we wanted to study around forced migration. So that's why we wanted to study forced migration and the sharing of memory, because forced migration seemed to provide a heuristic case study for these processes. Because it is based on uprooting and mass displacements, these large-scale homogenization of ethnic, religious, or even social security and or demographic reorganization efforts force displaced groups to redefine their affiliations in a twofold manner or movement. One that of their relationship and ties to the lost territories of origin, like the Heimat, what the Germans call the Heimat, and second, that of belonging to their new places of settlements, populated by groups considered to be co-nationals who generally do not welcome new arrivals with open arms. At the same time, the spaces they left behind are subject to processes of nationalization by the expelling states and appropriation or reappropriation by certain inhabitants who have remained in place and or by other individuals or groups who have resettled, often themselves expelled from elsewhere. So by examining the long-term effects of this chain reaction of population movements, in which more than often the victims becomes the perpetrator and perpetrators become victims, we can question the construction of identity, affiliation, disaffiliation, belongings, or exclusion, and the journey of individuals and groups between memory collective on either side of the borders and the new borders, to examine their content and uncover invisible ruptures and or links over time, and to question the modes of production of knowledge about this controversial past. So here are a few of the questions we asked to our case studies, which are, for instance, what happens when a social group loses the territorial anchor of its collective memory, is this group still able to pass on its memory and therefore its identity? If yes, how? Which functions do objects as entourage matériel have in this process? Which narratives survive, which new ones emerge, or which one disappears or are silenced, and which ones, maybe I would ask, re-emerge, and how? Then is it possible that memory of a specific group is taken over by a different group? How is the antagonism between them and us dealt with in this process? And which institutions ensure the transition from communicative memory to cultural memory, in which form and on whose behalf? And if the collective memory is oriented by what is important for the present, in which sense is it important for the current, let's say, Czech, Poles, Russians, to include Germans into the historical narrative at a national, at a regional, and at a local level? And in what way does this happen? Which temporalities can we observe? Are they congruent on both sides of the border? Like we have seen with the Bunzlau collection example, the time where the first ones, on the German part, interest starts very strongly declining. On the Polish part, interest is very strong, gets very strong. So the question of the temporalities are very important. And last but not least, which role do political narratives play in those processes? Very quickly, to finish, our approach is our ambition is to address the memory of population transfer and the effects on identity and sense of belonging of groups and individuals, no longer from a comparative perspective, as has been done extensively in recent years, including by myself in the book that was cited, which I did with Anne Bazin, but from a cross-cultural historical perspective. The aim is to consider together loss and appropriation, trauma and triumph, forced departure and resettlement of displaced population in their host states and societies, as well as the nationalization and repopulation of lost and conquered territories. We use objects as starting point for understanding the reconfiguration of memory, knowledge, and belonging, drawing on research into material cultures developed since the 70s, because we think that material environment contributes to the localization of the collective as symbols of identity and anchors of memories, as I have already told. So the transformations undergone by objects, particularly during periods of mobility, and which one point which is really important to us is that we not only study the mobility of the persons, but also the mobility of the objects or collection. So during periods of mobility associated with migration, but above all with exile, all these periods have already been the subject of numerous recent studies. These studies share a common perspective, that of the migrant or exilee, and focus mainly on the objects taken with them, even if they are still understood as traces of lost remnants of a larger whole left behind. And the metamorphoses of these objects taken behind are usually studied. And attention is paid to the shifts, reconfiguration of meanings, hues, and statuses linked to the change in the social world that occur during mobility and affect the relationships between subjects and objects. The relational dimension is emphasized, the capacity for evocation of objects in and from migration and exile. And based on all these researches who have already been done, we focus on the relationship with objects and material traces of exile, which convey a connection to the past and to a place left behind by Germans in Central and East Europe. And here we added the often neglected dimension, namely the study of the type of relationships built by individuals and groups who repopulated the territories of expulsions with objects left behind by the expelled Germans, but also by other disappeared groups like Jews, Sintis and Roma, Lemko, or the minorities like Lemkos. And although they are not absent from reflections on the material cultures of exile, the objects left behind are generally approached in a compartmentalized manner, either from the perspective of the relationship built by exiles from a distance, or from the perspective of the process of cultural appropriation of depopulated spaces. And our objective is to understand and analyze these both phenomena together, and to observe the encounters and interactions of various individuals, groups, and even state memory processes at the local, regional, and national levels, which may or may not unfold around these material traces of forced migrations, objects left behind, lost, destroyed, discarded, silenced, reinterpreted, taken away, recreated, rediscovered, and around their movements, their collection, their exchange, and returns. So objects are studies as zones of contacts, and we focus on observing the ability or inability of these objects to constitute these kind of contact zones evoked by Marie-Louise Prat, allowing or not individuals and groups to access the memory of other groups and to resist attempts to erase, forget, silence them, but also to reinterpret them. So I'm sorry I was a little long. Thank you very much for your attention. And this was my presentation.
Thank you very much, Catherine. One question, will you remain with us to the discussion, or shall we still have your discussion?
Yes.
So you will be there, yeah.
I can be here till the end of the panel, and then I have to move.
Wonderful, thank you so very much. Ewa Tartakowsky, the floor is yours for the remaining 30 minutes before the discussion.
Okay, so when I wait for my presentation, just a short information about the very great exhibition on displaying violence, first exhibitions on the Nazi occupation in Europe, 45-38, which was created by Agata Pietrasik, and which you can see at the very moment in Deutsch-Historisches Museum. Sorry for my accent. This presentation, it's a small step apart of my current research on the teaching of history of Jews in Poland, but it's still connected to the transmitting of history. In this case, based on my own experience in the university, at the university level. Sorry for sticking to my text, because I wrote it, and once it's written, it's difficult to interpret it more freely, so sorry. So at the heart of Warsaw, on the site of the former ghetto, now stands the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews. Built facing the monument of the ghetto heroes, designed by Nathan Rapoport in 1948, the museum has profoundly transformed the memorial topography of the neighborhood. Elżbieta Janicka describes the space saturated by signs as the symbolic topography, intended to prevent the emergence of alternative voices and to protect the heroic representations of the Polish national narrative. The pedagogical project I carried out this year with second-year students of Sciences Po in Paris, as a part of a seminar course devoted to the history and cultures of Central and Eastern European Jewries, seeks to explore this tension. The exercise I assigned to the class consisted of designing virtual counter-monuments in the space surrounding Polin, that is, imagining symbolic interventions capable of challenging the dominant memory promoted in the current urban space, and highlighting marginalized narratives. This paper will first focus on some of theoretical overview, but finally I cut most of them because I think it's better to go directly to these examples of the notion of counter-monuments, then place Janicka's work on the neighborhood's symbolic topography in perspective. And then I will present students' projects before analyzing some contributions and limitations of this pedagogical approach. So first, public monuments are privileged instruments of memory politics. They condense into stone, bronze, or urban space a particular interpretation of the past, a hierarchy of values, and the horizon of identification for the community. Monuments do more than recall events. They fix norms, prescribe forms of belongings, and inscribe the past into the social order. And I think all the examples we have seen today already talked much about it. Starting in the 80s, some artists and intellectuals, particularly in Germany, sought to overturn the traditional codes of monumentality. It was James Young who gave this approach its name of the concept of counter-monument. And here I will go quite quickly, but because maybe some of you know these examples. This is one of the most famous example, the monument against fascism in Hamburg, designed to gradually disappear under the inscriptions and signatures by passerby until it sunk completely into the ground. And here you can see the place, I mean, how it looks today. So you can only visit the monument through this plaque, which is just next to the monument. Several key features emerge to describe the counter-monument. So the first one is the ephemerality, like this one, by the way. Two, the participatory dimension, and also the construction, which echoes with the more questioning than glorifying the past, and also the ambivalence of this past. And so here you have other counter-monuments example, like the fountain which was built in Kassel, which is the inverted fountain. Another one which is much more participation-focused monument, like the Berlin Wall monument, for example. And of course, the history of Jews in Europe and of the Shoah has generated a proliferation of counter-monumental initiatives that question the very role of public space in commemoration. So one of the most famous is this Stolpersteine project, which you probably know, which is present in many, many cities in Europe. Here you have the one from Padova in Italy, but you have others like, for example, the street panels where the visitor has to stop and to read the panel precisely. You have also the very famous memorial of here I'm just giving the very famous example because probably you know most of them, the memorial of murdered Jews of Europe here in Berlin. You have also the empty library, which is not so well, I mean, in fact, this is some kind of hole into the ground. And also the Holocaust Memorial in Vienna, which is some kind of also the library project where books are put in the reverse side, so you cannot see what's the book, in fact. In Poland, several artistic interventions directly also engaged with the history of specific sites. Here I will give this example of Michalina crystal, black crystal in Wrocław, Breslau, which was the monument, which is also very ephemeral, as you can see, because it was, it's of course echoes the Crystal Night, but also the destruction of Jews in Europe. You have another one, which is the projection, the light projections of the synagogue of Tłomackie Street, which was projected in the actual building in Warsaw. You have also some kind of monuments which mark the location here of the former ghetto, and here also with the Berlin Wall. So you have also how all these monuments circulate, by the way. And also the footbridge of memory, which is some kind of also interactive monument in Warsaw, which commemorates the former ghetto, and where you have to look into this black box, to see some photos representing this bridge, which was really built to join two parts of the Warsaw ghetto. So as these examples show, the counter-monuments related to Jewish memory constantly oscillate between two poles. On the one hand, their capacity to give voice to silences and make absence visible, and on the other hand, their vulnerability to aestheticization, trivialization, or political appropriation. So reflection on counter-monuments, it's not limited to the artistic sphere. It also has major pedagogical potential. Teaching is not simply the transmission of facts, but also the creation of conditions for the critical learning experience of the past. As Bell Hooks notes, I quote, "The classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academia," end of the quote. And as Roger Simon also emphasizes, teaching is a process, and I quote, "through which we are encouraged to know, to form a particular way of ordering the world, giving and making sense of it," end of the quote. So in this context, one working with monuments and much more with counter-monuments make visible the tensions between official memory and critical memory, between dominant narratives, silences, and marginalized histories. Tradition monuments stabilize a univocal meaning. Counter-monuments, by contrast, open breaches, highlight absences, and invite participation. So I won't quote some studies which were already carried with some kind of virtual monuments or on counter-monuments, just to try to go more fastly to my objectives, my pedagogical objectives. So the first, my seminar or course aimed to develop a comprehensive perspective on public memory. The goal was not only to learn the history of Jews in Central and Eastern Europe, but also to question how this history is represented, commemorated, and sometimes instrumentalized in contemporary urban space. The second objective aimed to allow students to experiment with producing counter-monuments or counter-memories, and reflect not only of what is missing from and also reflect on what is missing from dominant narratives. And finally, the frameworks also aim to mobilize creativity as a tool for knowledge transmission and learning. So now I will go to this very space of which some of you know very, very well, but maybe some not. So this is the surroundings of Polin Museum. So the museum was inaugurated in 2013. This is the photo of the museum, and occupies a site particularly charged with history. It was built in the center of the former Warsaw ghetto, in the neighborhood marked by total destruction and the near complete disappearance of its Jewish population. The presence of the monument, of the museum, inscribes itself both in a memorial continuity and into a reconfiguration of the symbolic landscape. As early as in 46 and then in 48, two ghetto heroes monuments established an initial commemorative center. So here is the one of the 48, and yes, this is both of them, sorry. Honoring Jewish resistance and inscribing a heroic history in stone. For several decades, these monuments constituted the only landmark in the largely destroyed and rebuilt space. From the late 80s and 90s, additional commemorative gesture enriched this landscape, and you will see them after most of them. A tree of remembrance planted in 88 and nearby commemorative stones already reflected an intent to reinscribe a particular vision of history into public space. From 2000 onward, with the erection of monuments dedicated to the figures such as Willy Brandt, or the righteous among nations like Irena Sendler or Jan Karski, and more generally Polish righteous among nations, the symbolic environment of the site transformed into an increasingly dense memorial constellation. Elżbieta Leonicka analyzes this process of patrimonialization, showing how such commemorative choices contribute to rendering other dimensions of history invisible, particularly the centrality of the history of Polish Jew in the ghetto itself, as well as aspects of complicity, hostility, and indifference among parts of Polish society during the Shoah. And here I made this plan. In blue, you have the colors of monuments or elements dedicated to Jews. In red, you have elements dedicated not to Jews directly, and like 5 and 2, it's dedicated to both of them. Like 5, for example, it's archives of, dedicated to, anyway, you will see after the elements and the interventions of students. So red and blue, it's both Polish, non-Jewish, and Jewish memorialization, one would say. To describe this phenomenon, she speaks of the square of Polish innocence, referring both to the physical space, the square surrounding Poland, and the narrative space saturated with signs meant to protect the nation's image. According to her, this symbolic topography functions as a selective staging. What is presented is not the Jewish experience of the ghetto and its annihilation, but Polish innocence and dignity affirmed at the very heart of the site of extermination. So the methodology adopted followed a multi-step progression, combining documentary research, analysis, and digital creation. As students were in Paris and they could not travel to Warsaw for this seminar, they could do some exploration phase using the site videos filmed and photographs of the monuments taken by me. And also these visual materials were complemented by readings of academic text, enabled them to identify tensions between official and critical memory and to understand the problematic dimension of this commemorative space. So based on these, students were divided in groups, and they selected an existing monument they wanted to work on, and conducted analysis of first of the history of this monument, what's the history is commemorated, and then searching what is missing and so on. Then they could use digital tools. It could be, by the way, not only digital, it could be also paper sketches, but also digital tools. The AI modeling was totally open. They could also use the AI generative tools to develop imagined interventions to this urban space. And finally, each group presented its project to classmates in a collective setting that encouraged critical discussion. And the emphasis was placed less on the final work, but on a reflective dimension to try to justify the symbolic choices made and to examine how the imagined counter-monuments could make marginalized historical narrative visible. So here I will present you 6 projects which were designed by my students, which offered very diverse responses to the central question posed by this framework: how to create counter-monuments capable of giving voice to the silence or marginalized histories of a space saturated already by memorial signs. So here you have the first project. So the first project focused on the tree of shared memory, you can see on the left, planted in '88 in front of the on the Polin Museum. This living monument aimed to symbolize the common memory between Jews and Poles. It means non-Jewish Poles. It's rooted sinking into the same soil as the image of the shared destiny. The commemorative plaque emphasizes this union, honoring both Jews who were murdered and Poles who died trying to help them. However, as showed many of scholars, starting from Gross and others like Angelkin, Grabowski, and so on, the Polish majority did not share the same fate as the Jews. The notion of shared memory thus obscures the fundamental asymmetry between victims and witnesses, or even participants in the killings, between extermination and the survival of the majority. To address this tension, students imagine the inverted tree you can see on the right, a rusted metal tree overturned and buried beneath the square. I don't know if you can see it well. It's a little bit dark in this image. Mirroring the living trunk, this inverted sculpture materialized repressed memories and responsibilities. Viewers were invited to look into a dark void, and they were confronted with absence rather than life. This counter-monument does not negate the original tree, but by the way, it was also one of the aim. They couldn't replace the monument. They have to inscribe the new monument into the existing landscape. So it didn't negate this original tree, but complicates it. It reminds that memory is never fully shared and that what is buried continues to haunt the present. Through this intervention, the students aligned with Jung's idea of counter-monument as a monument against itself, with unsettled and questions rather than consoles. The second project, as its starting point, was the Żegota commemorative stone, which was inaugurated in 1905. You can see it on the left again, which recalled the actions of the Council to Aid Jews, stemming from the Polish underground state. It is, in its current form, this monument honors an organization very often presented as the embodiment of Polish, it means non-Jewish solidarity, but it largely obscures the role of Jewish resistors who were central actors of also this action. The effect produced is that of the homogenized national narrative, implicitly opposing Polish rescuers to Jewish victims and contributing to the marginalizing of Jewish experience in the public memory. To address this imbalance, the students choose to highlight the figure of Leon Feiner, a Jewish lawyer, resistor, and the last president of Żegota, of this organization. Their virtual counter-monument depicted Feiner emerging from the Warsaw sewer, recalling his role in the clandestine information transfer and its connection to Jan Karski, who was also the Polish non-Jewish resistor. I will talk a little bit after, because there is also a monument to Jan Karski in this spot. Above him, he bore on his shoulder the commemorative stone itself, transferred into a burden, both material and symbolic. This posture conveyed the idea that without the decisive contribution of Jewish resistors like Feiner, the organization could not be functioned. The installation was conceived in a two-level structure. The underground dark and partially hidden space symbolized both the sites of Jewish resistance and the hiding places of the ghetto population, as well as the invisibility of Jewish action in official narratives. The light projected from the sewer opening allowed this buried memory to be brought to the surface. Around the circle, a quote from Feiner, I quote, "Tell the Jewish leaders that they must find the strength and courage to make sacrifices no other statesmen have ever had to make. sacrifices as painful as the fate of my dying people, and as unique, end of the quote, inscribed the Jewish voice at the heart of the monument. This project thus combined historical critique and visual innovation. By shifting the narrative focus on Żegota toward one of its Jewish leaders, it resonated the organization's memory to its truly plural character. In line with Janicka's perspective, it denounced the logic of preemptive memory, which by exalting Polish solidarity obscures the magnitude of Jewish tragedy. The third project is the project focused on Irena Sendler Alley, which honors the heroic figure of the Polish resistor who saved hundreds of Jewish children in the ghetto. While this narrative is encouraged, and the narrative is obviously true and very tragic, it has often been used as national alibi, to quote Bikont, highlighting Polish Catholic solidarity while marginalizing the complicity and indifference that predominated. As Bikont emphasizes, Sendler herself was instrumentalized, her memory transferred into reassuring narrative for the nation. Here, the students choose to shift the focus. Rather than glorifying an individual figure turned symbol, their counter-monument aimed to honor the Jews who, within the ghetto, save other Jews, a story of solidarity largely absent from the public commemorations. And here I have to say that the names you see here, they are the names of the Jews from the Warsaw ghetto. They have no time to make any archives research, so these one are taken from the Yad Vashem Institute, but they are still Jewish rescuers, but not from the Warsaw ghetto. So just to be sure that we are talking about the right things. Their project consisted of inscribing the names of Jewish rescuers directly into the alley pavement, transforming the act of walking into an embodied experience of memory. The names appeared through light projections visible only at night, creating a deliberate ritual of remembrance. One had to enter the space into darkness to see these traces. The choice of light was not merely aesthetic. It evoked both the clandestine nature of the rescuers and the capacity of these acts to bring the glimmer of hope in the context of annihilation. The project echoed, of course, of the spirit of Stolperstein, but with a reinterpretation. The live projection gave the names a fragile, ephemeral visibility, yet impossible to ignore. This choice reflected a convention. The memory of Jewish rescues is not absent by chance. It has been relegated to the shadows of narratives privileging Polish Catholic figures. By projecting these names into the night, the students invited viewers to look toward what had been suppressed in the shadows and to reinscribe acts of Jewish courage into the commemorative space of the ghetto. The fourth monument is dedicated to Jan Karski. You can see the famous Karski bench, the Polish resistor who entered to the Warsaw ghetto and to transit also through, who also bear witness to the fate of Jews in occupied Poland. Yet Karski's testimony was not a part of the work of a complex network in which Jewish organizations like the Bund, the Jewish National Committee, or the World Jewish Congress played a crucial role in transmitting the same information to London. So the absence of these collective figures in the current monument reflects a selective memory, one centered on an individual and Polish heroism, thereby reducing Jews to the role of passive victims. The counter-monument proposed by students sought to shift this framework. Keeping Karski's figure on his bench, it inscribed next to him the traces of those who remained anonymous, a path of sculpted footsteps leading toward the monument. These footprints recall both the forced displacement of Jews toward the ghetto and also the clandestine work of those who guided Karski, represented by a pair of boots. The installation also added 2 new benches placed face to face. A ghetto bench marked with the Star of David, the left one, a reference to the segregated benches imposed in Polish university in 30s, and the unmarked bench symbolizing the majority population. Karski was positioned between the two, becoming a symbolic bridge. By inviting visitors to sit, choose a bench, or remain standing, the monument created a space of interaction. It was no longer about contemplating Karski as a heroic figure, but about reflecting on historical dilemmas. The 5th monument focused on the roundabout, and this is almost the last one, there is 6, the roundabout of the Polish races among nations. So to transform it into a counter-monument, the students drew inspiration from the carousel that operated next to the, I have no photo, sorry, of this carousel, that operated next to the Warsaw ghetto during the war, which continued running even as the uprising broke out. This carousel was immortalized by Czesław Miłosz in Campo dei Fiori and analyzed by Jan Błoński in his essay, The Poor Poles Look at the Ghetto. And it became also a symbol of Polish Catholic indifference in the face of the extermination of their Jewish neighbors. The final counter-monument took the form of a large carousel placed at the very center of this roundabout, encircled by a small barrier representing the ghetto wall. This arrangement inverted the usual proportions. The carousel, symbolizing indifference, became monumental, while the wall reduced the symbolic boundary between the Aryan side and the ghetto to a minimum. This visual inversion underscored that crossing this wall, metaphorical and fragile, would have been possible, and that inaction was a choice. It was inverted the dominant character of the space. The Polish Catholic space was minimized to this very roundabout circle, leaving the vast surrounding area to represent the Jewish ghetto outside the wall surrounding the roundabouts. By placing the emblem of indifference at the center, the project directly challenged the narrative of Polish solidarity. The roundabout ceased to be a place of national self-congratulation and questioned why did carousel keep turning? What does the continuity reveal about the surrounding society? Who in the public memory is placed at the center? And the final monument considered was the one of the Willy Brandt. And here you can see also the what's in this plaque. It's translated in English, which commemorates the German Chancellor kneeling gesture in 1970 before the monument to the ghetto heroes. This monument, interpreted as an act of national contrition and a key gesture of Ostpolitik, quickly became a major symbol of German-Polish reconciliation, as you can see in this monument. Yet, as Janicka has pointed out, it was also a gesture without Jewish addresses, focused on two states and relegating the direct victims of the genocide to the background. To challenge this logic, a group of students imagined the interactive counter-monument that compels visitors to do the same gesture as Brandt did. In place of the current statue, they designed a bronze plaque set into the ground, marked with two knee imprints. In front of it stands a pair of binoculars fixed at a low height precisely to kneel, and pointed toward the ghetto hero monument, forcing anyone who wishes to look through them to kneel down. This device no longer celebrates a statement. It invites each visitor to assume the gesture of tribute, voluntarily kneeling before the ghetto monument. Looking through the binoculars, oh, sorry, you don't see the monument, sorry. Oh, and, okay. Looking through the binoculars reveals a frieze of 4 chronologically arranged images. Sorry, you don't see them because it's very dark, I don't know why, but we have 4 images here. Jewish life, a photo of Jewish life in pre-war Muranów district in Warsaw, the ghetto under the occupation, the ruins after the uprising, and finally traces of contemporary commemoration in the public space. This sequence compels viewers to visually retrace the cycle of destruction and remembrance, reminding them that the Shoah was not merely a single tragic event, but a process of annihilation followed by a long period of erasure from the public view. So here I would like just to address some potential of this kind of pedagogical tool. First, I think that this kind of counter-monument experience gave students an opportunity to develop a critical perspective on memory politics. Second, the pedagogical experience is rooted in participatory and reflective learning. Throughout the semester, students benefited from the regular guidance in each class, as well as informal meetings outside the class, where ideas circulated freely and evolved through discussions. This back and forth between open discussion, pedagogical guidance, and critical reading form the core of this process, turning the creation of counter-monuments into the shared research project. And finally, the counter-monuments became also genuine pedagogical devices. This enabled a shift in the teaching of Jewish history and the Holocaust from the vertical logic of transmission of knowledge to the horizontal, more collaborative and reflective dynamic where creation, imagination, and critical analysis, also ethical responsibility, I would say, intervene to give meaning to the act of remembrance. And I fully know also that these kind of projects can be also be possible in the very specific pedagogical framework, like the group not more of 25 students, of time constraints, of everything we are dealing very often in our daily teaching or research life. This approach also opens up broader perspective. In Central and Eastern Europe societies, where debates over the memory of the Holocaust, and not only Holocaust but also anti-Semitism and 20th century violence, remain especially sensitive, counter-monument pedagogy could prove to be a valuable tool. It offers, in other contexts as well, the possibility to confront the plurality of memories, to experiment with alternative forms of narration, and to reflect on the political uses of the past. Because of their experimental, and I'm finishing here, fragile and participatory nature, the virtual counter-monuments reveal their full heuristic value in this setting. They remind us that history is not merely a body of knowledge to be transmitted, but also a field of learning where issues of citizenship and engagement are at stake. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so very much, Eva. We're more or less on time, rather less than more, but I guess we can easily have 20 to 25 minutes. Thank you, Zofia, for coming back. Catherine is here. So, dear audience, the first round of questions. Are there any immediate reactions? Besides Eva's one at the table. Yes. yes, no, not here. So I'll start maybe to launch the discussion with 2 or 3 small questions to each and every one of you. First, Catherine, maybe to turn to the screen. I was listening to you. I was thinking, do you plan also, because there's a huge amount of research on migration topics, to put it very widely, and their heritage. Listening to you, I was simply thinking about the very efficient expression coined by Salman Rushdie in his essays when he speaks about double unbelonging. And listening to you and looking at those objects that are belong but do not belong, they belong partly somewhere and circulate from here to there. I've allowed myself to check what Schlesian Museum is, which is not only a place, but if I understood well, also a hotel with some programmation that you can come, have a good beer and commemorate past times, which is also a part of such a high-mat industry being developed. To finally get to my question, do you plan also some comparative looks at different objects that may have circulated in, I don't know, post-colonial context, for instance, with different temporalities, but where also groups were moving from here to there and trying to find their way to belong somewhere or unbelong somewhere? That would be perhaps my first question. And a second one to you, Zofia. If I ask the three ones and launch the discussion, if you accept to do it. So, I was wondering, listening to you about the vibe, actually, and the vibe question. Did I understand you well? That from the perspective of the interviewees you had, the Pankiewicz pharmacy would be, in a way, could we understand it from their answers that the ideal museum to come would be as scenographic, as interactive almost as some Polish museums try to be, but still being balanced? Because if I understood well, one of the critics was that there is not enough authenticity because not enough objects in the German case, for instance. So to put it differently, what's from the exchanges you had, what's the perspective on the years and decades to come? How shall we build a discourse that could be able to answer to their needs given the AI times and the look for vibe and the stories being not only told but projected all the time? This is like a more prospective question out of very scientific elements. And same to you, Ewa Tartakowsky, a similar one to launch the discussion. Do you think, to what extent you think this kind of experience, which is absolutely fascinating and giving place to even to AI and imagination, could be done with different publics? Did you think of crossing publics other than, with all due respect, one of the most elitist schools France has, with students selected one by one, as some you perfectly know? Or do you even think technically of trying it with, I don't know, usual university public in France, for instance? So this would be to launch the discussion on my side. You're more than invited to do so. Yeah. Need to... No, because they won't hear on the Zoom.
In English, you can translate, please, because je voudrais revenir sur le rôle des émotions. Le rôle des émotions dans ce que vous proposez. Les questions générales sur l'agitation des émotions, qui est, on a vu dans vos communications comment on allait créer l'empathie, comment on allait mettre ce lien. Est-ce qu'il n'y a pas auparavant la nécessité quand même d'avoir une grammaire de l'histoire, c'est-à-dire de connaître effectivement l'histoire avant de pouvoir s'engouffrer dans ce que vous proposez? Et bien sûr, ma question s'adresse plus particulièrement à Eva. Je pense qu'il y a certainement eu avant une connaissance de l'histoire. Voilà, parce que agiter les émotions, oui, dans différents... voilà, mais ensuite, qu'est-ce qu'on fait avec cela? Et est-ce que cela ne peut pas parfois brouiller effectivement l'histoire?
If I may shortly, you understood the French? Yep. So everyone speaks French, actually. Bon.
So thank you very much. Fascinating, and like every paper added a layer to the whole structure of this discussion. I have 3 short questions. One is to Katerina, and I am not very familiar with the present status and situation of the Heimatstuben in general in Germany. I guess it's a movement, what to do with the objects, what to do with this memory that is pretty much happening as the generation that was directly interested is passing away. So what about the children? What about the community that was formed around it? Does it continue somehow? Or it becomes a sort of a scansens? I also had to Google Haus Schlesien, very interesting, and also comes to my mind to what extent it really functions around the history of Silesia, and to what extent it's just a hotel and restaurant with specific food. And a question to Zofia. What, in a similar vein, what would be, do you have a sort of like a good advice coming from this focus group for the practitioners? What is the kind of direction the participants were going to? It would be very much valuable to know from this perspective. And to Ewa, this is more my reflection as a person who lived there for a very long time, just a few minutes away. This is my closest roundabout that you were showing, and what was striking is the kind of like the incredible like amount of these monuments which are already there, and which is already a sign of a certain nervosity, huge nervosity about the topic that doesn't allow people just to stay silent and accept the presence of Polin without adding layer after layer in a very questionable, as you showed, also taste. Mainly the Karski and Żegota monuments, they are not of the highest quality, but like the idea of that we have to add something, we have to say something, because otherwise people who are coming, mainly I guess from Israel, won't understand what was the Polish experience. Did your student also reflect on that, or did they have a strong feeling that yes, something should be added? And by the way, I loved this first installation with the tree. It was really strong. Thank you.
It will be not a question, just more a comment to the presentation of Zofia Wóycicka about Markowa, because it will be just a comment on the intellectual history. On a way we erased memories of others, but because so far in our discussions it was this kind of a ambiguity or a conflict between national broader monopolization of memory by a national majority versus some minority. In Markowa, as far as I remember, especially coming from the region, in the first exhibition and around the fact when the Ulma family was claimed saints by the Catholic Church, the more horrifying thing for me was not even nationalistic framework, but the framework theological economy of salvation. So the silence of the Jewish victims was so much, I would say, swallowed by the economy of salvation and overshadowed the death of the Jews, as if this happened in order for the Ulma family to become saints. So this theological frame of the economy of salvation was even more potent and uncontestable in this kind of a self-centered story than nationalistic can ever be, in my opinion. So it's just a side comment on this whole discussion.
Ulma family, but nobody knows the names of the victims, Jewish victims. I mean, no, we know, but if you ask people, we know Ulma family, but nobody can quote. I mean, we know them, but we don't know them. This is the...
Well, thank you very much for the three fascinating papers. I had questions for the three of you. The first one to Zofia is actually, I was very interested by your methodology and the public that you focused on, but I was wondering if, in your opinion, there would be any difference with older people in your focus group. Do you think that, especially when it comes back to some kind of historical knowledge, some kind of historical background, do you think that they also have this kind of reaction because they were fresh somehow? The other question I had, actually, I had the same question about the role of the church for the Ulma Family Museum, but the other question I have was, do you think that the presence of foreign visitors also play a role in this reception? Because I guess that the Ulma Family Museum is rather visited by Polish nationals, not so much by foreigners, I guess. But the Krakow pharmacy is actually widely visited by its reverse, by foreign tourists, and it's part of a touristic. So do you think that the presence around the visits for the different people, for the students, yeah, I think that somehow they reacted differently because there was foreign visitors as well, and probably in Krakow, Jewish visitors and descendants of survivors, maybe. I don't know, but I'm just guessing here. The question I have for Catherine was actually you very much focus on objects left behind, but I have maybe a question that merely reflects my ignorance of the topic. Is there any kind of similar collection, similar museum for objects taken into exile by German expels? So is there something that also, I don't know, some kind of revendication of the origins here? It's something that was left behind mostly, if I understood you correctly, and objects. So here, I have in mind the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, where basically a lot of Jewish immigrants in the US gave to the museum a lot of objects reflecting all the places of origins of these immigrants. So is there something similar that you can work with? And to Eva, I have another stupid question that only reflects my ignorance. Did your students try to draw some parallels with other museums, other monuments, other museums, other memorial environment? I don't know how to call it, especially I'm thinking obviously about France, but also about France. Did they had something in mind did they try to, I don't know, to use some references that they had in mind from French environments and to use them here on the Polish example, but maybe other, you've shown a lot of monuments that are well known, especially to students in higher education. Places in France, in Berlin and elsewhere, did they try to replicate in a way this kind of monument? There's something like a Western European, I don't know how to call it, but a set of references that they used during this experience. Thank you very much.
I will suggest maybe we'll start after this first round continue with your answers currently. Yeah.
No. Yes. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Thanks for all the questions. I'm not sure I will be able to answer everything, but I will go maybe from the back. So first about this question about if the results were different, if it was another sample, or if those were, for example, older people. And first, of course, I don't know, so it's just an assumption. But I think they would be. It's a question of level of education, nationality, or where you come from, the background, and the age. And before we did that, at the Ulma Museum, at the pharmacy, I analyzed the visitor and the entries in the visitor books. And they showed the sort of real well, not real, of course, it's not everybody enters in the visitor book, but it was in a way more related to the real visitor profile, yes, than this artificial group in the Ulma Museum and in the pharmacy. And they were very, very different. It was much more because this group, exactly because also of this religious context, it's visited by sometimes by pilgrims, by right-wing groups like Gazeta Polska, it's a sort of right-wing newspaper which has its circles, by elderly people, by people from the neighborhood and so on. And there the responses were very different, like this museum seemed to resonate with very sort of nationalistic visions, like for example there was quite a number of entries responding to Jan Tomasz Gross and the neighbors, like, come Jan Tomasz Gross to this museum and see it's not only Jedwabne, but Markowa, even more so Markowa. And it's almost like a citation now, yes? So, and lots of, or good that this museum was finally built so that the people in Berlin, Brussels, and Tel Aviv will know how history really was. Yes? So there was some, not everything was like this, but the tone in general was very sort of, Holocaust was not existent. It was only about Poles and being heroes and so on. And this is actually the group which is in a way more representative for the museum. While as you saw, the responses of I was in a way very positively astonished that they did not question the narrative, the Polish students as too nationalistic or so on, but in fact they read it against the grain. Yes, they read out of it what was interesting for them and didn't highlight this heroic narrative and so on. So of course it depends on the group and the profile and so on, but I think it would be very different. And also that they had mostly those which in Rzeszów we had, in Markowa we had also some students from Kraków because it was very difficult to find in Rzeszów enough students. So there was, I think, also a difference in terms of students who traveled more, who saw other museums, and they had this sort of distance that they knew one can tell the story in this way or another, and there are other perspectives in history, and they were sort of then more sort of distanced and didn't buy the narrative as it is. So I think this makes would make a difference. The first thing, then going back to the vibe, the thing, and this is also to Jasia an answer, I don't think I can answer like there is one advice what you do, because exactly the question of the study was if there is a different in perception depending or what the background of the people and their sort of culture of memory, visual habits and so on are. And I think there is. So it's not, for example, many of the international students, mostly the German ones, didn't buy the experientiality of the pharmacy. This was this last slide when one said, okay, this was this reconstruction of the pharmacy, but the exhibition was actually not so much about the pharmacy, but about the Jewish ghetto, so there is no clear connection. And there's such a sort of ambiente you can build up everywhere. So only when I got to the last room, and there was a back door of the original back door of the pharmacy, which was closed, and there was a plate that here was the back door where some Jews would flee from the Umschlagplatz through the back door of the pharmacy, and then said, only then I noticed that this is the original place. And I was standing there, I was stunned, because now I understood this is the place we are talking about, yes? So I think much depends on where you are sort of coming from and what you're used to. And then to answer your question would be a bigger discussion again, and I can send you the article. But one thing which I think was throughout the groups was interesting, that some people claim now there is this new generation who needs new media and touch screens and interactives, and this is interesting for them. And of course, it's not a representative study in any way, but it was interesting that people were most, and it was throughout the groups, independent if they were local or international, that actually they said, okay, this whole multimedia and touch screens and so on, I have it here at in my hand. This is nothing new. I don't have to go to a museum to get this. And they will never at the museum, after 2 years, it's already outdated. So they will never be as sort of modern as my iPhone. And they were then much more attracted, maybe by interactive elements, but more low tech. And not so much by all this. Okay, but this is a very general thing, and for the rest I can send you the article when it's accepted. And yeah, and thank you for the comment on I didn't mention this so much because I didn't have much time, and also this didn't appear in the interview. So obviously the ULMAs were spoken wholly 2 years ago, but this was a very big long process. So this whole erection of the museum was taking place in this and also in this context, but this was not, and this is visible also partly in the exhibition, but this was not mentioned by the students, interestingly.
Okay, Catherine, if you can follow up with the first.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your questions. I think I'll start from the last one and coming back to the first ones then, because it kind of helps me. I will start with the museum landscape in Germany about the lost territories, and it's a very big museum landscape. In fact, in Berlin you have the last one, which was opened in 2021, which is the Dokumentationszentrum Flucht, Vertreibung, Versöhnung, which is really about flight and expulsion, and is federally financed. And that many expellees tried to give this museum their collections, and this museum will not accept them because they have already too much and they cannot store it, so they cannot play that role. But you have regional, also federally and founded by the Länder, a museum which are dedicated to all the lost bigger regions, like the Museum of Pomerania, the Schlesisches Museum zu Görlitz, about Silesia. You have the Donauschwäbisches Zentralmuseum in Ulm, and so on. You have the Ostpreußische Museum Lüneburg, and so on and so on. So you have about 12 of such institutions who display more the history of these lost lands and homelands, because not all used to be German territories. Some were like Czech territories or whatever. And those also have or they have many objects from there, and they're collecting them, but most of the time their storage are full, and they cannot take the objects proposed to them by the expellees and the organizations. And here I come to these Heimatstuben phenomenon, which is a phenomenon that started in the 50s. And there have been which is a much more local phenomenon, and there have been about 600 in the 80s of such Heimatstuben all over Western Germany. And this is what interested us, is what did they become? Because you're completely right, they're dying. And now we're at a moment of transition between this communicative memory, which they were part of, to this kind of cultural memory. And the question is, how does this happen? And half of them have disappeared. Half of them are still working, and half of them have kind of closed, you have 300 that have closed, among which about 55 were integrated into other museums. And the very interesting thing is that they were integrated very often into museums showing the history of the German Federal Republic, and they're integrated to show the beginnings, much less to show the history of the lost lands, but to show That was the beginning. It was a very important phenomenon at the beginning of the Federal Republic, the German Federal Republic, the Federal Republic of Germany, because there were so many ex-police, and that was part of the way they dealt with the loss, and that was part of the these Heimatstuben show the part of the integration, the history of the integration, and so on. So, and also, and this is another very interesting thing, they used to document very highly, how do you say, well, modern subject, which is immigration. And sometimes they're just paralleled in sometimes questionable ways with today's experience of immigrants. And there are parallels are drawn between integration experience of immigrants today and the experience of the ex-police arriving in Western Germany or in Germany at the end of the Second World War. So that is the fate of these small Heimatstuben. And that was, and like about 50 of them have been like put into storage, which we don't really know what that means. And the interesting thing, it was like the 15 to 20 which have been translocated, and that is what we are mostly studying. It's these collections that move back. And you were completely right. I think it's very interesting to study that or to have that in mind with the process, like, or to compare it, or maybe you cannot really compare it, but you can still have in mind the process of restitution of goods from colonial rule, and which were collected at that time. And so there are certainly parallels to be made and common reflections to have, like, because the interesting thing is maybe that the domination processes are pretty different in this case of the Heimatstuben and the ex-police. So you cannot completely transfer it, but it's still the questions. Some of the questions are very similar, and it's very interesting to think it together. And maybe about this double unbelonging from Sam and Rushdie, you're completely right. The Heimatstuben are very typical of that. Today, well, even though they have been integrated into other museums and so on, they have no more visitors. And I think that this memory is of very few interest to Germans today. Maybe, as I said, they're of interest as a part of Western Germany's history in the 50s and the arrival of the refugees, but not as a testimonial of the lost lands. And I think, and that was very clear in this Bunzlau example, that in Western Germany, and he was very bitter about that, the director of this association, is that neither his children nor the youth locally, because he was very active trying to connect to the youth in Siegburg, nor the history teachers, he was himself a history teacher in Siegburg, were interested at all in that collection. And the local history museum did not even accept them, and that was very bitter for the ex-police. And so they moved to Haus Schlesien. I will just come back to say a few words about Haus Schlesien. And then, well, one of the possibilities was to move back to Poland, where there was an interest. And the interesting thing, which I did not do yet because I don't speak Polish, but this interest should also be questioned. What was really interesting for the Poles, and it's very interesting to see which exhibition have been done together and where they were shown, and what was shown where, and what does it say about these common, shared narratives or not. And maybe very quickly about Haus Schlesien. Well, Haus Schlesien is fighting, is trying to survive the same way the Heimatstuben does. It's a kind of museum. It's kind of in between Heimatstuben and the bigger museum, which are financed by the Federation. And as you said, well, they're surviving because of their restaurant and their small hotel, and because they're nice. and certainly not because of the small exhibition about Schlesien they have. So it's all a question of time, how long these kind of institution will survive. So maybe that's all.
Okay, so the first question about the publics. So indeed, the Sciences Po public is specific. It's more than specific because it's I didn't mention, but because no time, this seminar is giving in English because it's an elective seminar for students from the from the general courses in Sciences Po of the second year, but also for the students in exchange. So that's why it's in English, in order to be understood by students in exchange. So they are coming from everywhere. That's true, from United States, from Canada, South America, Japan, and so on. Some of them are of Jewish origin. They are saying it, so that's why I can attest it. Some of them just want to discover what's the Jewish history in Eastern Europe. About the publics, I would say that I would do exactly the same course anywhere I would have to do it. And by the way, I also teach in Paris, in the University of Paris 8, Paris 8 and Paris 10 in Nanterre. And I'm also doing some creative pedagogies different assessments. And it works very well, even if they are not Sciences Po students. So I have a hope in the youth, and I think that it's possible. To come to the second question of Sylvie, can I answer in English, or you prefer in... It's okay. Okay, so about the role of emotion. So first of all, I have to say that I'm against any pedagogy based on emotions. It was not the aim of this seminar. In fact, the seminar was called History and Cultures of Jews in Central and Eastern Europe. So this is only the project they have to do to have a note. It was the counter monument and the text they have to do explaining the process of creative work and so on, and why Feiner and why not this or that. So during all this semester, they have the proper, very normal, I would say, historical course that I gave. I tried to do it more maybe interactively, but it was the history-based history from the Middle Ages to the 21st century. So it was a short course, of course, only 12 sessions, but still. And it started always, I started my lessons, my classes with the position test. I mean, I gave them position test with some questions in order to know what's their level of knowledge about this or that topic. It's not noted. I mean, they have to put their names, but it's not noted. And in the end, last year, I also gave the final exam. This year, no, because they have other projects to do also, but still, it was history-based. So it was totally not based on emotions, but on the objectivation of the uses of the past based on history and in the public space. So this is the second question. The question of presence in this very site. So first, I mean, what they had to do, it was to build the counter monument. So yes, I added new elements in already saturated space, so you're totally right. But it was the virtual one, so it's not anyway. I don't think so that they will pass in any governmental politics, memory politics in Poland. Anyway, but I agree with you that there is a problem with all these spots which are really saturated with very realistic interventions, monumental interventions. I wrote recently a paper which will be published soon on I mean, during my research, I was also visiting Auschwitz Museum with school groups and so on. So it was, I mean, many times. And one of the last visits, it was during the COVID. And I was alone, in fact. I have no group to observe, and I was alone, almost alone all the time. And I realized in how precisely the saturation of signs, by signs I mean guides, panels, descriptions, everything which is, I mean, you have to go, you have to write, some kind of guidance, finally blur the experience you can have. Maybe it's also connected to emotions, of course, but yeah, but maybe of the side of history, not necessarily of memory, but history. So I agree that maybe in this side, I totally agree that there is too much monuments anyway, and the Rapoport monument was the best one, and yeah. And the last one about other references in the French field. So in this class, I made also some kind of lesson on the monuments and counter monuments. So I showed them many of monuments. Some of them, they were well known, especially for European students, some totally not known. So I also gave some monuments from, I don't know, United States, Canada, South America also, in order to have some more, even from Japan, to make them feel that it's not only the Polish context. Strangely, I have very few French students, so we have no examples or reinterpretation from French side, but I also showed them and explained French, I would say, commemorative intervention, monumental interventions. And then they had, I mean, they could inspire themselves from what they have seen, from the history. And finally, I would say that what you have seen, some of them were totally invented by my students. Some of them were more directed by my suggestions of readings, not the intervention itself, but the reading. For example, the roundabout, they didn't know that there was a carousel just next to the ghetto, so I had to give them the example of Jan Boński text, which was translated in English. For the Feiner, it's the same. I just suggested that you can maybe read something about the last president, and then they invented the for others, it was fully, I mean, free. Then we have discussions, of course, what does it mean and so on. But yeah, and I think that's all.